Chapter 1, Loomings. You can call me Ishmael. A few years back, doesn't really matter how long, I was low on cash and had no particular plans, so I decided to head to sea and explore the watery parts of the world. It's something I do to clear my mind and get my energy flowing. Whenever I feel gloomy or restless, or when my thoughts get too dark, I know it's time for a change. Sometimes I get so out of sorts that it takes all my willpower not to do something reckless, like walking into the street and knocking people's hats off. That's when I know I need to get back to sea. For me, it's the perfect escape, a healthy alternative to more dangerous choices. Take New York, for example, surrounded by docks like coral reefs around an island, with the ocean constantly on the edges of the city. Streets lead down to the water, and the waterfront is filled with people staring out at the sea. If you walk around the city on a quiet Sunday, you'll notice something strange. Thousands of people are lost in thought, gazing at the water as if they're drawn to it. And these aren't sailors. They're regular city folk tied to desks, counters, and workshops during the week. Yet, they're all drawn to the sea, standing as close to it as they can without falling in. It's as if something deeper is calling them. This isn't just a city thing either. Head out into nature and you'll find the same pattern. No matter where you are, people are instinctively drawn to water. There's something magical about it, almost like a magnet for our thoughts and emotions. Artists know it too. Whenever they want to create a scene that captures peace and beauty, there's always water involved. Even in vast landscapes like the prairies, the one thing that feels missing is water. It's the one element that completes the picture, the thing that draws us in, whether we realize it or not. In the end, I've realized that going to sea is my way of dealing with life's challenges. Not as a passenger, mind you, I don't have the money or the patience for that. Instead, I sign up as a simple sailor. Sure, it's hard work and not exactly glamorous, but it keeps me grounded. No matter how rough things get, there's something satisfying about the rhythm of the sea and the simple life on board. It's a break from the complexities of life on land, and in its own way, it gives me a sense of freedom and purpose. So, why did I end up on a whaling voyage of all things? Honestly, I'm not sure. Something about the sheer mystery of the whale, the adventure of the distant seas, and the promise of facing the unknown pulled me in. I'm always drawn to the remote, the forbidden, the things that most people shy away from. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was curiosity, but whatever it was, the idea of hunting the great whale was irresistible to me. There's something about chasing the unknown that calls to me, and this voyage felt like the perfect answer. Chapter 2, The Carpet Bag. I packed a couple of shirts into my old carpet bag, slung it under my arm, and set out for Cape Horn and the Pacific. After leaving the great city of Manhattan, I made it to New Bedford. It was a cold Saturday night in December, and I was disappointed to learn that the small ship to Nantucket had already left. There wouldn't be another one until Monday. Most young men heading into the tough world of whaling stop in New Bedford to start their journey, but I had no intention of staying there. I had set my mind on sailing from Nantucket because everything about that rugged old island appealed to me. Although New Bedford had taken over much of the whaling industry, Nantucket was the original home of American whaling, the place where the first whale was hunted. The first whalers, Native Americans, went out in their canoes from Nantucket, and the first small ship from the island supposedly even threw imported cobblestones at whales to test how close they were for a harpoon strike. Now, with nearly 2 days and nights to kill in New Bedford before I could continue to my destination, I had to figure out where to eat and sleep. It was a dark, bitterly cold night, and I didn't know anyone in town. With little money in my pocket, I reminded myself to find a place that was affordable, no matter what. I wandered through the streets, passing an inn called the Crossed Harpoons, but it looked too expensive and lively. A bit further, I saw the bright red windows of the Swordfish Inn. The light seemed so warm that it had melted the snow outside, but again, it seemed out of my budget. My old worn-out boots couldn't handle the icy streets much longer, so I kept moving, following the streets that led toward the docks, figuring I'd find the cheapest inns there. The streets were desolate, lined with shadowy buildings, barely lit by a candle here or there. As I continued, I spotted a dim light coming from a low, wide building with its door open. It had a welcoming, though shabby look, so I went inside, only to trip over an ash box. After nearly choking on the flying dust, I joked to myself that this must be the ruins of some old city. But the crossed harpoons and the swordfish, it was not. This place felt more like a trap. Inside, I saw what looked like a gathering of dark figures. Dozens of black faces turned toward me, and a preacher stood at the front, thundering about darkness, wailing, and the gnashing of teeth. Realizing I had wandered into a black church, I backed out quickly, muttering that it wasn't quite the entertainment I was looking for. Eventually, I came across a flickering sign near the docks. It showed a faint image of misty spray and read, "The Spouter-Inn, Peter Coffin." The name Coffin, alongside Spouter, felt a little eerie, but I reminded myself that Coffin was a common name in Nantucket, and Peter was probably from there. The sign swayed in the wind, and the old, worn-down building looked like it had seen better days. This seemed like the right place for cheap lodging and a cup of watery coffee. The building itself was odd, an old, slanted house standing on a windy corner where the howling wind made me think of Euroclydon, the fierce wind that battered Paul's ship in the Bible. As I stood outside, I recalled a passage from an old book I'd read. It makes a big difference whether you're inside, looking at the frost from a warm window, or outside, feeling it on both sides. This was true enough, I thought, as I shivered in the cold. Inside, the rich could make their own summer with a cozy fire, but out here, there was no escaping the freezing wind. Poor souls like Lazarus, huddled against the cold, would probably trade places with the wealthy inside, no matter how cold it got. But enough of those thoughts. It was time to focus on the task at hand. I scraped the ice from my frozen boots and stepped into the Spouter-Inn, ready to see what kind of place it really was. Chapter 3, The Spouter-Inn. When you entered the gabled Spouter-Inn, you found yourself in a wide, low, rambling hallway with old wooden paneling that reminded you of the walls of an old doomed ship. On one side hung a massive oil painting, so darkened by smoke and so damaged that, in the uneven lighting, you could only begin to understand it through careful study, multiple visits, and asking the locals about it. The chaotic shadows and shapes at first made you think that some ambitious young artist from New England's witch-hunting days had tried to capture a scene of chaotic madness. But after much contemplation, especially by opening the little window at the back of the hallway, you finally decided that such an idea, though wild, wasn't entirely out of the question. What really baffled you was a long, ominous, black shape floating in the center of the painting, hovering over three blue, hazy, vertical lines in a strange, frothy sea. It was a murky, confusing painting, enough to drive someone with a nervous disposition mad. Yet there was a kind of mysterious, incomplete grandeur about it that drew you in, making you determined to figure out its meaning. Every now and then, a new idea would strike you, only to disappoint. Maybe it was the Black Sea in a storm at night, or the battle of the elements, or a bleak landscape, or a frozen scene in the far north, or perhaps it was the breaking up of the icy river of time. But eventually, all these ideas gave way to one central mystery. What was that strange, dark mass in the middle? Once you figured that out, everything else would make sense. But wait, could it be a giant fish? Could it be a whale? In fact, the artist's intention seemed to be this, a theory of my own, partly based on what I heard from older locals. The painting depicts a ship rounding Cape Horn in a fierce hurricane, half sunk with its three broken masts visible. An enraged whale about to leap over the ship seems on the verge of impaling itself on the masts. On the opposite wall was an assortment of monstrous weapons, clubs and spears. Some were fitted with gleaming teeth like saws, others tufted with human hair, and one was shaped like a sickle with a long handle, as if used to mow down people. The sight of these made you shudder, imagining the savage cannibals who wielded them. Mixed in were old, rusty whaling lances and harpoons, many broken and warped. Some had stories behind them. With one long lance now bent and twisted, Nathan Swain had killed 15 whales in a single day 50 years ago. And that corkscrew-shaped harpoon was thrown in the seas of Java, carried away by a whale, and found years later off Cape Blanco, still embedded in the whale's hump. After crossing this gloomy hallway and walking through a low arched passage, cut through what must once have been a giant central chimney, you entered the public room. This room was even darker, with heavy beams overhead and old, creaky floorboards beneath, making you feel like you were in the cabin of an ancient ship, especially on such a stormy night when the old building seemed to sway. On one side was a long, low table covered with cracked glass cases full of dusty curiosities collected from the far corners of the world. In the far corner stood a dark alcove, the bar, shaped somewhat like a whale's head. Whether intentional or not, there was the enormous bone of a whale's jaw, so wide a coach could almost pass under it. Inside, shabby shelves held old bottles and decanters. In those jaws of death, like a cursed Jonah, was a shriveled old man who, for the right price, sold sailors liquor that would lead them to ruin. The tumblers he served drinks in were dreadful. Though they looked like proper glasses from the outside, the insides were tapered deceitfully, so they held less than they appeared to. Markings etched into the glass showed how much you'd pay. A penny for a small amount, another penny for a little more, and a shilling for a full glass, called the Cape Horn measure. When I entered, a group of young sailors was gathered around a table, examining various pieces of scrimshaw in the dim light. I approached the landlord and asked for a room. He told me that every bed was occupied. "But hold on," he said, tapping his forehead. "You don't mind sharing a bed with a harpooner, do you? I figure you're going whaling, so you might as well get used to it." I told him I didn't like sharing beds, but that if I had to, it would depend on the harpooner. If he wasn't too objectionable, and if there really was no other option, I'd share a bed rather than wander around a strange town on such a bitter night. Thought so. "All right, take a seat. You want supper?" "Supper'll be ready soon." I sat down on an old wooden bench that was carved all over, like those in Battery Park. One sailor nearby was busy adding his own carving with a knife, working intently on a picture of a ship in full sail, though he wasn't making much progress. Eventually, 4 or 5 of us were called to eat in a room next door. It was as cold as Iceland, no fire at all. The landlord said he couldn't afford it. We ate by the dim light of 2 candles, each wrapped in its own waxy shroud. We buttoned up our coats and clutched cups of steaming tea to warm our freezing fingers. The food was hearty, though: meat, potatoes, and of all things, dumplings. One young man in a green coat attacked the dumplings as if his life depended on it. "My boy," said the landlord, "you're going to have nightmares for sure." "Landlord," I whispered, "that's not the harpooner, is it?" "Oh no," he said with a mischievous grin. "The harpooner's a dark-skinned fellow. He doesn't eat dumplings, just steaks, and he likes them rare." "The devil he does," I said. "Where is he? Is he here?" "He'll be here soon," the landlord replied. I couldn't help but feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooner. I made up my mind that if we were going to share a bed, he'd have to undress and get into bed before I did. After supper, everyone returned to the bar, and not knowing what else to do, I decided to hang around and observe. Soon, we heard a commotion outside. The landlord jumped up, saying, "That's the crew from the Grampus. I saw her off this morning after a 3-year voyage with a full ship. We're about to hear the latest news from the Fiji Islands." The door burst open, and in came a wild bunch of sailors. Wrapped in their thick coats and wool scarves, with icicles hanging from their beards, they looked like a group of bears from the Arctic. This was the first place they'd entered after docking, so naturally, they made a beeline for the bar. The old man running the bar, who everyone called Jonah, quickly served them drinks. One sailor complained of a bad cold, so Jonah mixed him a thick concoction of gin and molasses, claiming it was a cure for any cold, no matter where you caught it. The liquor soon hit their heads, as it always does with sailors fresh from the sea, and they started dancing and shouting. One of them, however, stood apart from the rest. He didn't want to ruin their fun, but he kept to himself and remained quieter. This man caught my interest. Since we'd soon become shipmates, though only in a limited sense, I'll describe him now. He was about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a chest like a fortress. His skin was deeply tanned, making his white teeth stand out in contrast. His eyes held a shadow of some unhappy memory. His voice revealed that he was a Southerner, and judging by his height, I guessed he was a mountaineer from Virginia. While his shipmates were at their wildest, he quietly slipped away, and I didn't see him again until we sailed together. A few minutes later, his absence was noticed, and his shipmates, who clearly liked him a lot, started shouting, "Bulkington! Where's Bulkington?" and ran out to find him. It was around 9 o'clock, and after the noise died down, the room felt eerily quiet. I started thinking about an idea I had earlier. No one likes to sleep with another person in their bed. In fact, most people would rather not even share a bed with their own brother. There's just something about sleeping that makes you want your own space. And when it's with a complete stranger in a strange inn in a strange town, and that stranger is a harpooner, your objections multiply quickly. There was no reason I, as a sailor, should have to share a bed any more than anyone else. Sailors don't even share beds on ships. They have their own hammocks and blankets. The more I thought about this harpooner, the more I hated the idea of sleeping with him. It was safe to assume, being a harpooner, that his clothes weren't exactly clean. The thought made me shudder. It was getting late, and if he was decent, he'd be coming back to the inn and heading to bed soon. What if he stumbled in at midnight? Who knows where he'd been? "Landlord, I've changed my mind about the harpooner. I'm not sleeping with him. I'll sleep on this bench," I said. "Suit yourself. Sorry I don't have a tablecloth to use as a mattress. It's a rough bench," he replied, feeling the notches in the wood. "Wait a minute, Scrimshander. I've got a carpenter's plane in the bar. I'll smooth it out for you." He grabbed the plane and, after dusting off the bench with his old handkerchief, began planing away, grinning the whole time. Shavings flew everywhere until he hit a knot in the wood and nearly sprained his wrist. I told him to stop, saying the bed was fine as it was, and no amount of planning would turn it into something soft. He laughed, threw the shavings into the stove, and left me alone. I measured the bench and found it was a foot too short, but I figured I could fix that with a chair. However, it was also too narrow, and the other bench in the room was higher, so I couldn't push them together. I set the bench against the wall, leaving space for my back, but soon realized there was a cold draft coming from the window, along with another from the door. They combined to create a mini whirlwind right where I planned to sleep. I started to think about locking the harpooner out of the room and stealing his bed, but then I worried he might knock me out in the morning when he found me. I considered that maybe I was being unfair. Maybe the harpooner wasn't as bad as I imagined. I decided to wait until he arrived and see what he was like before making any decisions. But as time passed and more boarders came in and went to bed, there was still no sign of the harpooner. "Landlord, what kind of guy is this harpooner? Does he always stay out this late?" It was nearly midnight. The landlord chuckled again, clearly amused by something I didn't understand. "No, he's usually an early bird. Early to bed, early to rise. But tonight, he went out to sell something, and I don't know what's keeping him unless he's having trouble selling his head." "Selling his head? What kind of nonsense is that?" I asked, getting frustrated. "That's right," said the landlord, and I told him he wouldn't be able to sell it here. The market's flooded. "With what?" I shouted. "With heads, of course. Aren't there too many heads in the world?" "I've had enough of this nonsense," I said. "You'd better stop with this story. I'm not falling for it." "Maybe not," he replied, picking his teeth with a stick. "But you'll be in trouble if the harpooner hears you talking about his head like that." "I'll break his head," I shouted, furious. "It's already broken," said the landlord. "Broken? What do you mean?" I asked. "That's why he can't sell it." "Landlord," I said, walking up to him as calmly as a snowstorm on Mount Hecla, "stop whittling and listen. You and I need to come to an understanding right now. I come to your inn looking for a bed, and you tell me I can only have half of one because the other half belongs to some harpooner I haven't even seen yet. And instead of giving me any straight answers, you keep telling me these bizarre and frustrating stories about this guy, making me uncomfortable about having to share a bed with him. Now, sleeping next to someone is a pretty personal and intimate thing, landlord. So, I need you to tell me straight who this harpooner is and if it's safe for me to sleep in the same bed with him. And first off, take back that ridiculous story about him selling his head. If that's true, the guy is clearly insane, and I'm not about to sleep next to a madman. If you're trying to make me do that knowingly, you'd be in some serious legal trouble." "Well," the landlord sighed, taking a deep breath, "that's quite the speech from someone who gets worked up now and then. But calm down, calm down. This harpooner I've been talking about just got back from the South Seas, where he bought a bunch of embalmed heads from New Zealand. They're rare curiosities, you know. He sold all but one, and he's trying to sell that last one tonight because tomorrow's Sunday, and it wouldn't be right to sell human heads in the street when people are heading to church. Last Sunday, he was about to go out with 4 heads strung together like onions, but I stopped him just in time." This explanation cleared up the strange mystery and showed the landlord hadn't been trying to mess with me. Still, I couldn't help but wonder about this harpooner, who spent his Saturday night, right into Sunday morning, doing such a creepy thing as selling the heads of dead people. "You can't deny it, landlord. This harpooner is dangerous," I said. "He pays on time," was his response. "But look, it's getting late, and you should get some sleep. That bed is great. My wife, Sal, and I slept in it the night we got married. There's plenty of space for 2. It's a massive bed. Back then, we used to fit our sons, Sam and Johnny, at the foot of it. But one night I had a wild dream, rolled around too much, and poor Sam got thrown off the bed and almost broke his arm. After that, Sal said it wouldn't do. Anyway, come on, I'll grab you a candle in a second," he said, lighting one and offering to lead the way. But I hesitated. Glancing at the clock in the corner, he said, "Well, it's officially Sunday. You won't see that harpooner tonight. He's settled somewhere else. Come on, let's go." I thought about it for a moment, then followed him upstairs. He led me into a small, cold room with a massive bed, big enough, honestly, for 4 harpooneers to sleep side by side. "There you go," said the landlord, setting the candle on a rickety old sea chest that doubled as a washstand and table. "Make yourself comfortable. Good night." I turned to look at the bed again, but when I turned back, the landlord was gone. I folded back the quilt and examined the bed. It wasn't fancy, but it seemed all right. Looking around, I noticed there wasn't much else in the room, just a rough shelf on the wall, a papered-over fireplace with an image of a man striking a whale, and that sea chest. On the shelf, I saw some strange bone fishhooks, and at the head of the bed was a tall harpoon. In the corner, there was a hammock rolled up on the floor and a large sailor's bag, probably belonging to the harpooner. Then I noticed something on the chest. I picked it up, held it to the light, and tried to figure out what it was. It looked like a large doormat, with little decorative tags around the edges, similar to the quills on an Indian moccasin. There was a hole in the middle of it, like a poncho. But could any sane harpooner really wear this thing and walk around in public? Out of curiosity, I put it on. It was thick, heavy, and damp, as if the harpooner had worn it on a rainy day. I looked in a small piece of glass stuck to the wall and could barely recognize myself. I tore it off quickly, straining my neck in the process. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I thought about the head-selling harpooner and his strange doormat. After some more thinking, I took off my coat and stood in the middle of the room, still pondering. Finally, I felt too cold to keep thinking, and remembering what the landlord said about the harpooner probably not coming home tonight, I decided to just go for it. I quickly undressed, blew out the candle, and climbed into bed, saying a quick prayer for safety. The mattress felt like it was stuffed with corn husks or broken pottery, and I tossed and turned for a long time. I was just starting to drift off when I heard heavy footsteps in the hall and saw a light under the door. Dear God, I thought, it must be the harpooner, the creepy head seller. But I lay perfectly still, determined not to say a word until he spoke first. Holding a candle in one hand and a New Zealand head in the other, the stranger entered without looking at me. He set the candle down in a corner and started working on the knots of his large bag. I was eager to see his face, but he kept it turned away for a while. When he finally turned around, I nearly jumped out of my skin. What a sight! His face was a dark, purplish-yellow color, with strange black squares all over it. At first, I thought he'd been in a terrible fight and was covered in bandages, but then I realized they weren't bandages at all. They were tattoos. I remembered a story about a white man who had been captured by cannibals and tattooed. This harpooner must have had a similar experience. And after all, I thought, it's just his appearance. A man can be decent no matter what he looks like. But his strange complexion still puzzled me. It wasn't just the tattoos. It was like he had been stained by something else entirely. Maybe it was just a deep tan from the tropical sun, though I'd never seen a tan turn someone that color. While all these thoughts raced through my head, the harpooner ignored me completely. After he finally got his bag open, he pulled out a tomahawk and a sealskin wallet, placing them on the chest. Then, he stuffed the New Zealand head back into the bag. He removed his hat, and to my surprise, his head was almost completely bald, except for a small knot of hair on his forehead. His purple, bald head looked like a decaying skull. If he hadn't been standing between me and the door, I would have bolted out of there faster than I've ever moved before. Even so, I thought about slipping out the window, but I was on the second floor. I'm no coward, but I had no idea what to make of this head-selling, purple-skinned guy. Ignorance breeds fear, and since I was completely puzzled and confused about the stranger, I have to admit I was as scared of him as if the devil himself had broken into my room in the middle of the night. In fact, I was so terrified that I didn't even have the courage to confront him and demand some explanation about what was so strange about him. Meanwhile, he kept undressing, and eventually I saw his chest and arms. To my shock, they were covered with the same squares as his face. His back was the same too. It looked like he had been through a war, wearing a checkerboard of bandages. His legs were even marked, with dark green shapes climbing them like frogs on tree trunks. By now, it was obvious that he must be some kind of savage, picked up by a whaling ship in the South Seas, and now here he was, in a Christian country. The thought made me shake. A seller of heads, maybe even the heads of his own people. He might decide he wants mine. God, look at that tomahawk. But I didn't have time to keep trembling, because now he started doing something that completely grabbed my attention and convinced me he was truly a heathen. He went over to his heavy coat, hanging on a chair, rummaged through its pockets, and finally pulled out a strange little figure with a hump on its back, about the color of a 3-day-old baby from Congo. Thinking of the preserved head, for a moment I thought this tiny figure was a real baby that had been mummified. But since it wasn't flexible at all and shined like polished wood, I figured it must be a wooden idol, which indeed it turned out to be. He went up to the fireplace, removed the paper that covered it, and placed this hunchbacked idol between the iron fire dogs. The fireplace was covered in soot, which made it look like a fitting little shrine for his Congo idol. I squinted hard at the half-hidden figure, feeling uneasy, wondering what would happen next. First, he took a handful of shavings from his coat pocket, carefully placed them in front of the idol, and then put a piece of ship biscuit on top. Lighting the shavings with his lamp, he started a small fire. After some quick snatches at the flames and faster pulls back, it looked like he was burning his fingers, he finally managed to grab the biscuit. He blew on it to cool it down, and then politely offered it to the little black figure. But the idol didn't seem interested in the dry offering at all. It didn't move. All these odd gestures were accompanied by even stranger guttural sounds from the man. Like he was chanting a prayer or singing some pagan hymn, his face twitching the whole time. Eventually, he put out the fire, grabbed the idol, and casually stuffed it back into his coat pocket, like a hunter putting away a dead bird. All these weird rituals only made me more uncomfortable, and seeing that he was finishing up his business and about to jump into bed with me, I figured it was now or never. I had to break this strange silence before the light went out. But I took too long to decide what to say. He picked up the tomahawk, examined it for a moment, then puffed out thick clouds of tobacco smoke from the pipe hidden in the handle. The next second, the light went out, and this wild-looking man, with the tomahawk still between his teeth, leaped into bed next to me. I yelled, I couldn't help it, and he let out a grunt of surprise, starting to feel around for me in the dark. Stammering, I rolled against the wall and begged him, whoever or whatever he was, to stay calm and let me get up to relight the lamp. But his deep guttural responses made it clear that he didn't really understand me. "Who are you?" he finally asked. "You don't talk, huh? Damn it, I'll kill you." And with that, He waved the lighted tomahawk around in the dark, scattering hot tobacco ashes all over me until I was afraid my clothes would catch fire. Thankfully, just then, the landlord burst in with a light, and I jumped out of bed and ran to him. "Don't worry," the landlord said with a grin. "Queequeg here wouldn't hurt a hair on your head." "Stop grinning," I shouted. "Why didn't you tell me this harpooner was a cannibal? I thought you knew. Didn't I tell you he's been selling heads around town? But calm down and go back to sleep. Queequeg, you understand me. I understand you. This man will sleep with you, okay?" "Okay, plenty," Queequeg grunted, puffing on his pipe and sitting up in bed. "Get in," he said to me, waving his tomahawk as if to say, "I won't bother you." I stood there for a moment, looking at him. Despite all his tattoos, he actually seemed like a clean, decent-looking guy. What was I so worked up about? The man's human, just like me. In fact, he probably has as much reason to fear me as I do him. Better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. "Landlord," I said, "tell him to put away that tomahawk, or pipe, or whatever it is. Tell him to stop smoking, and I'll get in bed with him. But I don't want anyone smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous, and I'm not insured." The landlord translated this to Queequeg, who immediately put out the pipe and motioned politely for me to get into bed. He even rolled over to one side as if to say, "I won't touch you." "Good night, landlord," I said. "You can go now." I got in bed and slept better than I ever had in my life. Chapter 4. The Counterpane. When I woke up the next morning at dawn, I found Queequeg's arm draped over me in the most affectionate way, like I was his wife or something. The quilt on the bed was a patchwork of different colored squares and triangles, and his tattooed arm, covered in a complex maze of patterns, looked like part of the quilt. His tattoos, each in different shades from spending time in the sun and shade, blended in with the quilt so well that I could barely tell the difference between them. I only knew it was his arm because of the weight and pressure of it hugging me. I felt strange. It reminded me of something that happened when I was a kid, though I still don't know if it was real or just a dream. I had been messing around, probably trying to climb up the chimney like I'd seen a chimney sweep do recently. And my stepmother, who was always scolding me or sending me to bed without supper, dragged me out and sent me to bed even though it was only 2 in the afternoon on the longest day of the year. I felt miserable, but there was no getting out of it, so I slowly went upstairs, undressed, and got into bed with a heavy sigh. Lying there, I calculated that I had to stay in bed for 16 whole hours before I could get up again. 16 hours! My back ached just thinking about it, especially with the sun shining in the window and the sounds of life outside. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore and got up, sneaking downstairs in my socks to beg my stepmother to give me a spanking instead of making me stay in bed. But she, being the strict and conscientious woman she was, sent me right back to my room. I lay there for hours, feeling worse than I ever had in my life. Finally, I must have fallen into a restless sleep, but when I woke up, the room was dark. I felt a shock go through my body. I couldn't see or hear anything, but it felt like a ghostly hand was holding mine. My arm was lying over the blanket, and it seemed like some silent, invisible figure was sitting by my bed, holding my hand. I was terrified, frozen in fear, unable to pull my hand away. I thought if I could just move my hand even a little, the spell would break. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, but I never forgot that moment, and I've puzzled over it ever since. Now, take away the fear, and that's how I felt waking up with Queequeg's arm around me. Once I remembered everything that happened the night before, I found the situation more funny than scary. I tried to move his arm, but even in his sleep, he held on to me like we were joined at the hip. I called out his name, Queequeg, but all he did was snore. Eventually, I rolled over, my neck feeling trapped, and felt something sharp. When I moved the blanket, I saw his tomahawk lying beside him like a baby. What a ridiculous situation, I thought. Here I was, in a strange bed, with a cannibal and his tomahawk. "Queequeg, for heaven's sake, wake up!" I kept squirming and complaining until I finally got a grunt out of him. He pulled his arm back, shook himself like a wet dog, and sat up, rubbing his eyes like he wasn't quite sure how I ended up in his bed. Slowly, it seemed to come back to him, and he looked at me, blinking in recognition. I lay there watching him, no longer afraid but curious about this strange man. Finally, Queequeg seemed to accept the situation, got out of bed, and politely signaled that he would get dressed first and leave the room to give me some privacy. I thought to myself, for a savage, that's quite civilized. It just goes to show that even so-called savages have a sense of courtesy. I had been rude, staring at him as he dressed, but I couldn't help it. He was such a fascinating sight. He started by putting on his tall beaver hat and, still without his pants, began looking for his boots. What he did next baffled me. Boots in hand and hat on his head, he crawled under the bed, where I could hear him struggling to put his boots on. I've never heard of any rule that says a man has to be private when putting on his boots. But Queequeg was clearly in a transitional phase, part savage, part civilized. If he were fully civilized, he wouldn't have crawled under the bed to put on his boots. If he were fully savage, he might not have bothered with boots at all. Eventually, he emerged with his hat crushed down over his eyes and started walking around the room, limping as if the boots, which were probably too tight, were causing him discomfort. Seeing him like that, with no curtains on the window and the street in full view, I asked him to speed up his dressing and get his pants on. He complied, then washed himself, but to my surprise, he only washed his chest, arms, and hands, leaving his face untouched. He then took out a bar of soap and, after lathering his face, grabbed his harpoon, unsheathed the head, and started shaving with it. I was amazed at how skillfully he used the harpoon as a razor. After finishing his unusual grooming routine, he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped in his coat and carrying his harpoon like it was a scepter. Chapter 5, Breakfast. I quickly followed suit, heading down to the bar room, where I greeted the smiling landlord with a friendly demeanor. I held no grudge against him, despite the teasing he had given me about my bedfellow. A good laugh is a wonderful thing, albeit too rare, which is a shame. So if anyone provides a good joke, they shouldn't hesitate to share it and enjoy the moment. A person who brings humor into the world is often more remarkable than you might think. The bar room was filled with boarders who had come in the night before, and I hadn't really had a chance to look at them yet. Most of them were whalemen, chief mates, second mates, third mates, ship carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, harpooneers, and shipkeepers. They were a rough and muscular bunch with bushy beards, looking unshaven and shaggy, all dressed in their monkey jackets as morning gowns. You could easily tell how long each one had been on land. This young man had a healthy complexion like a sun-toasted pear and probably smelled just as sweet. He couldn't have been back from his Indian voyage for more than 3 days. The man next to him looked a few shades lighter, almost as if he had a hint of satin wood in his skin. A third man had a slightly bleached tropical tan, clearly having spent several weeks on land. But no one could compare to Queequeg, whose cheek, marked with various shades, resembled the western slope of the Andes, displaying different climates all at once. "Breakfast is ready," called the landlord, throwing open a door, and we all filed in. They say that men who have traveled the world become more relaxed and self-assured in social settings. That's not always the case, though. Take Ledyard, the famous New England traveler, and Mungo Park, the Scottish one. They were among the least at ease in social gatherings. Perhaps crossing Siberia in a dog-drawn sled like Ledyard did, or taking a long, solitary walk in Africa as Mungo did, isn't the best way to gain social polish. Still, you can usually find that sort of ease anywhere. I thought of this when we all sat down at the table, expecting to hear some good whaling stories. To my surprise, almost every man remained completely silent. Not only that, but they looked uncomfortable. Here were a bunch of sea dogs, many of whom had boldly faced great whales in the open sea, total strangers, and killed them without flinching. Yet, here they were at a friendly breakfast table, all with similar backgrounds, looking around at each other as sheepishly as if they had never left a farm in the Green Mountains. It was a curious sight, these bashful, timid whalemen. But Queequeg was different. He sat at the head of the table, completely at ease. I can't say much for his manners, though. Even his biggest fan couldn't justify his bringing his harpoon to breakfast and using it without hesitation. He reached across the table with it, endangering several heads, while grabbing the beefsteaks. But it was certainly bold of him, and everyone knows that doing something confidently is often considered stylish. We won't go into all of Queequeg's quirks here, like how he skipped the coffee and hot rolls and focused solely on the rare beefsteaks. Suffice it to say, when breakfast was over, he went back into the public room, lit his tomahawk pipe, and sat there quietly smoking and digesting his meal, still wearing his hat, while I headed out for a stroll. Chapter 6: The Street. At first, I was surprised to see someone as unusual as Queequeg mingling among the polite society of a civilized town, but that surprise quickly faded during my first daylight stroll through the streets of New Bedford. In bustling seaport towns, you often come across the strangest-looking people from foreign lands. Even in places like Broadway and Chestnut Streets, Mediterranean sailors sometimes bump into startled women. Regent Street isn't unfamiliar to Lascars and Malays, and in Bombay's Apollo Green, Yankees have often made the locals uneasy. But New Bedford tops them all. While you might see only sailors in places like Water Street and Wapping, in New Bedford, you can find actual cannibals chatting at street corners. Real savages, some of whom still carry the remains of their last meals. It definitely makes a stranger stop and stare. In addition to the Fijians, Tonga-Tabors, Arromangoans, Penangians, and Briggians, and the wild characters from the whaling industry who roam the streets, you'll also encounter even more curious, and certainly more comical, sights. Each week, dozens of eager young men from Vermont and New Hampshire arrive, hungry for fortune and glory in the whaling industry. Most are strong and young. They're the kind of guys who have cleared forests and now want to put down the axe and pick up a harpoon. Many of them are as inexperienced as the green mountains they come from. Some seem so out of place, they might as well have just arrived. Look at that guy strutting around the corner. He's wearing a beaver hat and a swallow-tailed coat, cinched with a sailor's belt and sheath knife. Here comes another one in a sou'wester and a bombazine cloak. No dandy from the city can compare to a country dandy, a true bumpkin dandy, someone who would mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves during the summer to avoid tanning his hands. Now, when a country bumpkin like this decides to make a name for himself and joins the whaling industry, you have to see the ridiculous things he does when he gets to the seaport. While ordering his sea gear, he asks for bell buttons on his waistcoat and straps for his canvas pants. Oh, poor hayseed. How those straps will snap in the first fierce storm, dragging everything, straps and buttons included, into the tempest. But don't think that New Bedford has only harpooneers, cannibals, and bumpkins to offer its visitors. Not at all. Still, it is a strange place. Without the whalemen, this area might have been as desolate as the coast of Labrador. Parts of the surrounding countryside are so barren they could scare anyone. Yet the town itself might just be the most expensive place to live in all of New England. It is indeed a land rich in oil, not like the Promised Land, but it also produces corn and wine. The streets don't run with milk, nor do they pave them with fresh eggs in spring. Yet, despite this, you won't find more impressive houses or more lavish parks and gardens anywhere else in America than in New Bedford. Where did they come from? How did they grow out of this once barren land? Just look at the iron harpoons decorating that grand mansion, and your question will be answered. Yes, all these magnificent houses and beautiful gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. They were all harpooned and dragged up from the depths of the sea. Can Herr Alexander pull off a feat like that? In New Bedford, fathers are said to give whales as dowries to their daughters and to portion out a few porpoises to their nieces. You have to visit New Bedford to see a truly extravagant wedding. They say every home has oil reserves, and every night they burn their lengths in spermaceti candles without a second thought. In the summer, the town is lovely to behold, filled with grand maple trees, long avenues of green and gold. In August, the beautiful horse chestnuts rise high in the air, offering their tapering clusters of blossoms to passers-by like candelabras. Such is the power of art, which has turned many desolate areas of New Bedford into vibrant terraces of flowers, born from the rocky refuse discarded at the end of creation. And the women of New Bedford? They bloom like their own red roses. But roses only blossom in summer, while the radiant color in their cheeks is as constant as sunlight in the seventh heaven. You won't find such beauty anywhere else, except perhaps in Salem, where I hear the young girls smell so sweet that their sailor boyfriends can catch their scent from miles away, as if they were approaching the fragrant Moluccas rather than the Puritan shores. Chapter 7. The Chapel. In New Bedford, there's a whaleman's chapel that many moody fishermen about to set sail for the Indian Ocean or Pacific make a point to visit on Sundays. I definitely did. After my first morning walk, I went back out for this specific reason. The weather had shifted from a clear, cold, sunny day to a mix of sleet and mist. Bundling myself in my shaggy bearskin jacket, I fought against the fierce storm. When I entered the chapel, I found a small, scattered group of sailors along with their wives and widows. A heavy silence hung in the air, only occasionally broken by the howling wind outside. Each worshiper sat apart, as if their individual grief was too personal to share. The chaplain hadn't arrived yet, and there these silent groups sat, staring intently at several marble tablets with black borders set into the walls beside the pulpit. 3 of them had inscriptions that read something like this, though I can't quote them exactly. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot, who, at 18, was lost overboard near the Isle of Desolation off Patagonia, November 1st, 1836, is erected to his memory by his sister. Sacred to the memory of Robert Long, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth Macy, and Samuel Glegg, part of the crew of the ship Eliza, who were pulled out of sight by a whale in the Pacific Ocean, December 31st, 1839. This marble is placed here by their surviving shipmates. Sacred to the memory of Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who was killed by a sperm whale on the coast of Japan, August 3rd, 1833. This tablet is erected to his memory by his widow. After shaking off the sleet from my icy hat and jacket, I sat near the door and was surprised to see Queequeg sitting next to me. He seemed genuinely affected by the solemn atmosphere, wearing an expression of incredulous curiosity. He was the only one who noticed my entrance because he couldn't read, so he wasn't focused on those cold inscriptions on the wall. I didn't know if any relatives of the sailors whose names were listed were present in the congregation, but many women there clearly bore the signs of ongoing grief. It was clear that, for them, seeing those bleak tablets reopened old wounds. Oh, you whose loved ones lie buried beneath green grass, who can stand among flowers and say, here lies my beloved. You don't know the desolation that lingers in hearts like these. What painful emptiness lies in those black-bordered tablets that cover no ashes. What despair in those unyielding inscriptions. What empty spaces and unacknowledged betrayals haunt the lines that seem to gnaw at all faith, denying resurrections to those who have vanished without a grave. Those tablets could just as well stand in the cave of Elephanta as here. In what account of living beings are the dead included? Why is it that a universal saying tells us they can't share their stories, even though they hold more secrets than the Goodwin Sands? Why do we add such a significant and disbelieving word to the names of those who have just departed for the next world, yet we don't do the same for someone embarking on a journey to the farthest corners of this living earth? Why do life insurance companies pay death benefits to the deceased? In what eternal, unchanging paralysis lies ancient Adam, who died 60 centuries ago? Why do we continue to mourn for those we believe are in unspeakable bliss? Why do the living strive so hard to silence the dead? Why does a mere rumor of knocking in a tomb scare an entire city? All these questions have their meanings. But faith, like a jackal, feeds among the graves, and from these dead doubts she gathers her most vital hope. It hardly needs saying how I felt on the eve of a Nantucket voyage as I looked at those marble tablets and, by the murky light of that gloomy day, read the fates of the whalemen who had come before me. Yes, Ishmael, you may face the same fate. Yet somehow, I found myself feeling cheerful again. There are tempting reasons to set out, promising chances for advancement. Yes, a stoveboat will make me an immortal by merit. Sure, there's danger in whaling. A swift, chaotic plunge into eternity. But so what? I think we've misunderstood the nature of life and death. What we call my shadow here on earth might actually be my true essence. In terms of spiritual matters, we're too much like oysters looking at the sun through water and thinking that thick water is the thinnest air. I believe my body is merely the residue of my true self. Honestly, take my body if you want. It's not really me. So here's to Nantucket. Let the stove boat and the stove body come when they may, because when it comes to my soul, not even Jupiter himself can break it. Chapter 8. The Pulpit. I hadn't been seated for long when a robust man walked in. As soon as the stormy door swung open to let him in, everyone in the congregation quickly turned to look at him, clearly recognizing him as the chaplain. Yes, it was the renowned Father Mapple, a favorite among whalemen. He had been a sailor and harpooner in his youth, but for many years he had dedicated himself to the ministry. At the time I'm writing about, Father Mapple was in the strong winter of a healthy old age. A kind of old age that seemed to blend into a second youthful bloom, with gentle glimmers of vitality shining through his wrinkles, like spring greenery peeking through February's snow. Anyone seeing Father Mapple for the first time would be intrigued because he bore certain distinctive clerical traits from his adventurous maritime life. When he walked in, I noticed he didn't carry an umbrella, nor had he arrived in a carriage. His tarpaulin hat was soaked with melting sleet, and his heavy pilot jacket was almost dragging him down from the weight of the water it had soaked up. However, he gradually removed his hat, coat, and overshoes, hanging them up in a little corner, and then approached the pulpit in a respectable suit. Like most traditional pulpits, this one was quite high. Since a regular staircase would take up too much space in the already cramped chapel, it seemed the architect had taken Father Mapple's suggestion and designed the pulpit without stairs, opting instead for a vertical side ladder, similar to those used for climbing onto a ship from a boat at sea. The wife of a whaling captain had provided the chapel with a lovely pair of red worsted ropes for this ladder, which, nicely finished and stained a mahogany color, fit well with the chapel's character. Pausing for a moment at the foot of the ladder and gripping the decorative knobs of the ropes, Father Mapple glanced up, then, with a sailor-like yet respectful agility, climbed the ladder hand over hand, as if he were scaling the mast of his vessel. The vertical parts of this ladder were covered in cloth rope, while the rungs were made of wood, resulting in a joint at each step. When I first caught sight of the pulpit, I noted that, while convenient for a ship, these joints seemed unnecessary in this case. I was not prepared to see Father Mapple, after reaching the top, slowly turn around and deliberately pull the ladder up step by step until it was entirely inside, leaving him secure in his little sanctuary. I pondered this for a while, not fully understanding the reason behind it. Father Mapple was known for his sincerity and holiness, so I didn't think he was trying to draw attention to himself with theatrics. No, I thought, there must be a serious reason for this act. It must symbolize something deeper. Could it be that by isolating himself physically, he was symbolically withdrawing spiritually from all worldly ties and connections? Yes, to the faithful man of God, this pulpit serves as a stronghold, a high fortress with a never-ending well of inspiration within its walls. But the side ladder wasn't the only unusual feature inspired by the chaplain's seafaring past. Between the marble memorials on either side of the pulpit, the wall behind it was decorated with a large painting of a brave ship battling a fierce storm near a shore of black rocks and crashing waves. Above the stormy skies and dark, rolling clouds, there floated a small island of sunlight, from which an angel's face shone down. This bright face cast a distinct light on the ship's turbulent deck, much like the silver plate now set into the Victory's deck where Nelson fell. "Ah, noble ship," the angel seemed to say, "keep going, brave ship, and hold your course, for behold, the sun is breaking through, the clouds are lifting, calm skies are ahead." The pulpit itself also had a maritime flair, resembling the bow of a ship, with the Holy Bible resting on a beautifully designed scroll that mimicked a ship's bow. What could be more meaningful? The pulpit is always the most important part of the earth. Everything else is secondary. The pulpit leads the world. From there, the storms of God's quick wrath are first seen, and the bow must face the brunt of it first. From there, the God of fair and foul winds is first called upon for favorable breezes. Yes, the world is like a ship on its journey, and the pulpit is its prow. Chapter 9. The Sermon. Father Mapple stood up and, with a gentle but authoritative voice, called the scattered congregation to come together. Starboard side, move over to port. Port side to starboard. Midships, everyone. There was a low rumbling of heavy boots on the benches and a slight shuffle of women's shoes, but soon everything was quiet, with every eye focused on the preacher. He paused for a moment, then knelt at the front of the pulpit, folded his large brown hands across his chest, closed his eyes, and offered a prayer so deeply sincere that it felt like he was kneeling and praying at the bottom of the sea. Once he finished, he began to read the following hymn in a solemn tone, reminiscent of a bell tolling for a ship lost at sea in a fog. As he neared the end, his tone shifted to one of joyful exultation. The ribs and terrors in the whale arched over me a dismal gloom, while all God's sunlit waves rolled by and lifted me, deepening down to doom. I saw the opening maw of hell, with endless pains and sorrows there, which none but they that feel can tell. Oh, I was plunging to despair. In black distress I called my God. When I could scarcely believe he was mine, he bowed his ear to my complaints. No longer did the whale confine me. With speed he flew to my relief, as if carried on a radiant dolphin. Awful yet bright, as lightning shone the face of my deliverer God. My song shall forever record that terrible, that joyful hour. I give the glory to my God. His is all the mercy and the power. Nearly everyone joined in singing this hymn, and it rose above the howling storm. After a brief pause, the preacher slowly turned the pages of the Bible, finally resting his hand on the right page. Dear shipmates, let's focus on the last verse of the first chapter of Jonah. And God had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Shipmates, this book, with only 4 chapters, 4 stories, is one of the smallest strands in the mighty cable of the Scriptures. Yet Jonah's story touches profound depths of the soul. What a powerful lesson this prophet teaches us. How noble is that song in the fish's belly. It's as grand as a rolling wave. We feel the flood surging over us. We sink with him to the kelp-filled depths. Seaweed and all the sea's muck surrounds us. But what is the lesson from the book of Jonah? It's a twofold lesson for all of us as sinful beings, and for me as a servant of the living God. As sinful people, we can all learn from this story of Jonah's disobedience, sudden fears, swift punishment, repentance, prayers, and ultimately his deliverance and joy. Just like every sinner, Jonah's sin was his willful disobedience to God's command, regardless of what that command was or how it was given, which he found difficult to accept. But remember, everything God asks us to do feels hard. That's why he often commands rather than persuades us. When we obey God, we must disobey ourselves. And that's where the difficulty of obeying God lies. With this sin of disobedience weighing on him, Jonah further defies God by trying to escape from him. He believes a ship built by men can take him to places where God doesn't rule, only the earthly captains. He skulks around the docks in Joppa, looking for a ship headed to Tarshish. There's perhaps a deeper meaning here. Most scholars agree that Tarshish was likely the modern city of Cadiz. And where is Cadiz, you ask? It's in Spain, as far across the water from Joppa as Jonah could have possibly sailed back then, when the Atlantic was largely unexplored. Joppa, or modern Jaffa, is on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, while Tarshish, or Cadiz, lies over 2,000 miles to the west, just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. Don't you see, then, that Jonah was trying to flee from God on a global scale? What a miserable man. So contemptible and deserving of scorn, with his hat pulled low and his guilty gaze sneaking away from his God, prowling among the ships like a thief desperate to escape. His disheveled and self-condemned appearance is so obvious that if there had been police back then, Jonah would have been arrested on suspicion before he even stepped aboard a ship. He's clearly a fugitive. No luggage, no hatbox, suitcase, or travel bag. No friends are there to bid him farewell at the dock. Finally, after much dodging and searching, he finds the ship to Tarshish, taking on the last of its cargo. As he steps on board to speak with the captain in the cabin, the sailors pause their work to notice the stranger's guilty look. Jonah sees this, but futilely tries to appear relaxed and confident. His pathetic smile only makes him seem more like a coward. The sailors' instincts tell them he can't be innocent. In their playful yet serious manner, one whispers to another, "Jack, he's robbed a widow." Or, "Joe, look at him. He's a bigamist." Or, "Harry, I bet he's the adulterer who escaped from Gomorrah, or maybe one of the missing murderers from Sodom." Another sailor runs to read the notice posted at the dock, offering a reward of 500 gold coins for the capture of a parricide, which includes a description of the suspect. He reads it, then glances between Jonah and the notice, while all the other sailors gather around Jonah, ready to grab him. Terrified, Jonah shakes, and even as he gathers his courage, he only looks more like a coward. He refuses to admit that he's being suspected, but that itself raises suspicion. He makes the best of it. When the sailors realize he isn't the man they're looking for, they let him go, and he heads down into the cabin. "Who's there?" the captain calls from his desk, hurriedly filling out customs papers. "Who's there?" Oh, how that innocent question rattles Jonah. For a moment, he almost turns to flee again. But he collects himself. "I'm looking for a passage on this ship to Tarshish. When do you sail, sir?" Up until now, the busy captain hadn't looked up at Jonah, but as soon as he hears that hollow voice, he glances up suspiciously. "We sail with the next tide," he finally replies, still scrutinizing him. "No sooner, sir?" Jonah asks. "Soon enough for any honest man who's traveling as a passenger." Ha! Another jab at Jonah, but he quickly tries to steer the captain away from that line of thought. "I'll sail with you," he says. "How much is the fare? I'll pay now." It's particularly noted in this story that he paid the fare before the ship set sail, and this detail is significant. Now, Jonah's captain was someone who could spot crime in anyone, but he only showed greed for those who had no money. In this world, shipmates, sin that can pay its way travels freely without a passport, while virtue, if it's poor, gets stopped at every border. So the captain decides to test the depth of Jonah's pockets before he judges him openly. He charges him 3 times the normal fare, and Jonah agrees. Then the captain realizes Jonah is a fugitive, but he also decides to help someone whose flight is paved with gold. However, even when Jonah takes out his money, the captain's cautious suspicions still nag at him. He checks every coin for counterfeits. "Not a forger," he mutters, and Jonah is booked for his passage. "Show me to my cabin, sir," Jonah says now. "I'm tired from traveling and need to sleep." "You look like it," the captain replies. "There's your room." Jonah goes in and tries to lock the door, but there's no key. Hearing him fumble, the captain laughs quietly to himself and mutters something about how the doors of prisoners' cells are never allowed to be locked from the inside. All dusty and disheveled, Jonah throws himself onto his bed, finding the ceiling almost pressing against his forehead. The air is stuffy, and he struggles to breathe. In that cramped space, sunk below the ship's waterline, Jonah senses the impending doom of the moment when the whale will swallow him whole. A lamp swings slightly on its axis against the wall in Jonah's room, and as the ship leans toward the dock with the weight of the last cargo, the lamp, though moving slightly, still remains tilted in relation to the room. In reality, it's perfectly straight. It only highlights the false, crooked angles of the space around it. This lamp unsettles Jonah. Lying in his bed, his tormented eyes scan the room, and this successful fugitive finds no refuge for his restless gaze. But the contradiction of the lamp increasingly terrifies him. The floor, the ceiling, and the walls are all crooked. "Oh, so my conscience hangs within me," he groans. "Straight above it burns, but the chambers of my soul are all twisted. Like someone who stumbles to bed after a night of heavy drinking, still reeling but with their conscience pricking them. Just as the pounding of a Roman racehorse drives its steel shoes deeper into the ground, Jonah, in his miserable state, tosses and turns in dizzy anguish, praying to God for annihilation until the turmoil passes. Eventually, amid the whirl of sorrow, a deep stupor overtakes him, much like the man bleeding to death, for his conscience is the wound, and there's nothing to stop it. So, after struggling in his berth, Jonah's heavy misery drags him down into a troubled sleep. Now the tide has come. The ship casts off its ropes, and the deserted dock watches as the uncelebrated ship to Tarshish, swaying to one side, glides into the sea. That ship, my friends, was the first recorded smuggler, and Jonah was the contraband. But the sea rebels, it refuses to bear this wicked burden. A terrible storm arises, and the ship is on the verge of breaking apart. As the boatswain calls for everyone to lighten the load, boxes, bales, and jars clattering overboard, the wind shrieks, the men yell, and every plank trembles under the pounding feet right above Jonah. In the midst of this raging chaos, Jonah sleeps his dreadful sleep. He doesn't see the dark sky or the stormy sea, feels nothing of the shaking timbers, and barely hears the distant rush of the mighty whale, which is now pursuing him with its mouth wide open. Yes, shipmates, Jonah has gone down into the hold of the ship, a cabin like the one I've taken, and is fast asleep. But the frightened captain comes to him and screams in his ear, "What do you mean, O sleeper? Get up!" Startled from his lethargy by that terrifying cry, Jonah stumbles to his feet and makes his way to the deck, grabbing a rope to look out at the sea. But at that moment, a huge wave crashes over the side of the ship. Wave after wave pours in, roaring from front to back, nearly drowning the sailors while still afloat. Every time the frightened moon peeks out from the steep gullies in the dark sky, Jonah sees the ship's bow pointing high up, only to be slammed back down toward the turbulent depths. Fear upon fear runs screaming through his soul. In all his cowering postures, the fugitive from God is now unmistakably revealed. The sailors notice him. Their suspicions grow stronger, and finally, to determine the truth, they cast lots to see who's responsible for this terrible storm. The lot falls on Jonah, and when this is discovered, they swarm him with questions. What is your job? Where do you come from? What's your country? What people are you from? But notice, my shipmates, how poor Jonah behaves. The eager sailors are only asking him who he is and where he's from, yet they not only receive answers to those questions, but also an unsolicited response to a question they didn't ask, forced out of Jonah by God's heavy hand upon him. "I am a Hebrew," he cries, "and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." You fear him, Jonah? Yes, you certainly should fear the Lord God. Right away, he goes on to make a full confession, and the sailors become increasingly alarmed, but still feel pity for him. When Jonah, knowing the darkness of his actions and not yet begging God for mercy, tells them to throw him into the sea because he knows this great storm is on account of him, they compassionately turn away and try to save the ship in other ways. But it's all in vain. The furious winds howl even louder. Then, with one hand raised to God and the other reluctantly grasping Jonah, they prepare to toss him overboard. And now look at Jonah being lifted like an anchor and dropped into the sea. Instantly, a calmness spreads from the east, and the sea becomes still, as Jonah carries the storm with him, leaving smooth waters behind. He goes down into the swirling heart of chaos, hardly noticing the moment he drops into the gaping jaws awaiting him. And the whale snaps shut its ivory teeth, like so many white bolts around his prison. Then Jonah prays to the Lord from the belly of the fish. But pay attention to his prayer and learn a valuable lesson. Even though he is sinful, Jonah doesn't weep and wail for immediate deliverance. He understands that his dreadful punishment is deserved. He leaves his deliverance in God's hands, content to keep looking toward his holy temple despite all his pain. And here, shipmates, is true and faithful repentance, not clamoring for pardon, but being grateful for punishment. And how pleasing to God was Jonah's behavior is shown by his eventual rescue from the sea and the whale. Shipmates, I don't present Jonah to you as a model for his sins, but I do present him as an example of repentance. Sin not, but if you do, be sure to repent like Jonah. As he spoke these words, the howling of the storm outside seemed to give the preacher even more power. When he described Jonah's sea storm, he seemed to be tossed by a storm himself. His deep chest heaved as if with a ground swell. His flailing arms mirrored the chaotic elements at work, and the thunder rolling from his brow and the light flashing in his eyes made all his simple listeners gaze at him with a strange fear they had never felt before. There was a moment of silence as he turned the pages of the book again. Finally, standing still with his eyes closed, he seemed to be communing with God and himself. Then he leaned toward the people, bowing his head in a humble manner, and spoke these words. Shipmates, God has placed only one hand upon you. Both his hands weigh heavily on me. I've tried to understand, with the limited insight I have, the lesson Jonah teaches all sinners, and therefore to you, but even more so to me, for I am a greater sinner than you. How gladly I would come down from this high place and sit among you, listening as you listen, while one of you reads me that other, more terrifying lesson that Jonah teaches me as a servant of the living God. Being an anointed prophet, called by the Lord to deliver uncomfortable truths to the wicked city of Nineveh, Jonah, frightened by the hostility he might face, ran from his mission and sought to escape his duty and his God by boarding a ship in Joppa. But God is everywhere. He never reached Tarshish. As we've seen, God confronted him in the belly of the whale, swallowing him down into the depths of despair. The swift currents dragged him into the middle of the sea, where the churning depths pulled him down thousands of fathoms, wrapping seaweed around his head as the watery world of suffering engulfed him. Yet even from a place where no line could measure depth, out of the belly of hell, when the whale hit the ocean's floor, God heard the repentant prophet when he cried out. Then God spoke to the fish, and from the icy darkness of the sea, the whale breached toward the warm and pleasant sun and vomited out Jonah onto dry land. That's when the word of the Lord came a second time, and Jonah, bruised and battered, his ears still echoing with the sounds of the ocean, obeyed God's command. And what was that command, shipmates? To preach the truth in the face of falsehood. That was it. This, shipmates, is that other lesson, and woe to the servant of the living God who ignores it. Woe to anyone who lets the charms of this world distract them from their gospel duty. Woe to those who try to calm the storm when God has stirred it into a tempest. Woe to anyone who seeks to please rather than to warn. Woe to those whose reputation matters more than righteousness. Woe to anyone who doesn't confront dishonor in this world. Woe to anyone who won't be true, even if being false could bring salvation. Yes, woe to anyone who, as the great Paul said, while preaching to others, is themselves lost. He paused for a moment, then raised his face again, revealing deep joy in his eyes as he exclaimed with heavenly enthusiasm, "But oh, shipmates, alongside every sorrow there is certain joy, and that joy rises higher than the depth of the sorrow. Is not the mainmast higher than the keel is low? Joy belongs to those who stand firm in their own unwavering self against the proud gods and captains of this earth. Joy is for those whose strength supports them when the treacherous ship of this world sinks beneath them. Joy is for those who spare no effort in seeking the truth, destroying all sin, even if it means pulling it from beneath the robes of senators and judges. Joy, ultimate joy, belongs to those who recognize no law or authority but their Lord God, and are only loyal to heaven. Joy is for those whom the crashing waves and roaring mobs of the world can never shake from their solid foundation. Eternal delight will be theirs who, when it comes time to rest, can say with their last breath, "O Father, known to me chiefly by your rod, mortal or immortal, here I die. I have strived to be yours more than to belong to this world or to myself. Yet this is nothing. I leave eternity to you. For what is man, that he should live out the lifetime of his God?" He said no more, but slowly waved a blessing, covered his face with his hands, and remained kneeling until everyone had left, leaving him alone in the place. Chapter 10. A Bosom Friend. When I returned to the Spouter-Inn after leaving the chapel, I found Queequeg sitting there all alone. He had left before the benediction a while ago. He was sitting on a bench in front of the fire, his feet resting on the stove hearth, holding his little black idol up to his face. He was intently gazing at it while gently whittling its nose with a jackknife and humming to himself in his own way. When he noticed me, he put the idol away and soon went to the table, where he picked up a large book and placed it on his lap. He started counting the pages with a steady rhythm. Every 50th page, at least that's what I thought, he would stop, look around with a vacant expression, and let out a long, surprised whistle. Then he would begin again, starting from the first page, as if he could only count to 50. It was as if he was amazed by the sheer number of pages every time he found another 50. I watched him with great interest. Though he looked quite savage and his face was ugly to me, there was something about him that was not unpleasant. You can't hide the soul. Through his strange tattoos, I thought I saw signs of a simple, honest heart. His large, deep black eyes seemed to hold a spirit that would challenge 1,000 devils. Besides all this, there was a certain dignity about him that even his roughness couldn't diminish. He looked like a man who had never bowed to anyone or had a creditor. Whether it was because his head was shaved, giving his forehead a more prominent and open appearance, I can't say, but it was clear that he had a great head. It might sound silly, but it reminded me of General Washington's head as seen in popular busts. It had that same long, gently sloping retreat from above the brows, which were very prominent, like two long cliffs thickly forested on top. Queequeg was a cannibalistic version of George Washington. While I was observing him closely, pretending to look out at the storm through the window, he didn't seem to notice me at all. He didn't give me a single glance, appearing completely absorbed in counting the pages of his marvelous book. Considering how sociably we had shared a bed the night before, especially the affectionate arm I had felt around me when I woke up, I found his indifference quite strange. But savages can be strange. At times, it's hard to know how to interpret their behavior. At first, they can be intimidating. Their calm and collected simplicity seems like Socratic wisdom. I also noticed that Queequeg didn't interact much with the other sailors in the inn. He made no effort to engage with them and didn't seem interested in expanding his circle of friends. This struck me as very peculiar, yet upon reflection, there was something almost sublime about it. Here was a man, 20,000 miles from home, through Cape Horn, which was the only route he could take, surrounded by people as unfamiliar to him as if he were on another planet, yet he seemed completely at ease. He maintained a serene demeanor, content with his own company, always steady in himself. Surely this was a glimpse of fine philosophy, even if he had never heard of such a thing. Perhaps to be true philosophers, we mortals shouldn't be aware of living or striving in that way. As soon as I hear someone claiming to be a philosopher, I tend to think that, like the old dyspeptic woman, they must have broken their digester. As I sat there in that now empty room, with the fire burning low, just glowing after its initial warmth had faded, I noticed the evening shadows gathering around the windows, silently watching us while the storm rumbled outside. I started to feel some strange emotions. I felt a kind of melting inside. No longer were my broken heart and angry hands turned against the harsh world. This soothing savage had changed that. He sat there, his indifference revealing a nature free from the hypocrisies and bland deceits of civilization. He was wild, a sight to behold, but I found myself drawn to him in a mysterious way. Those very things that would have pushed most people away were the same things that attracted me to him. I thought, I'll try being friends with a pagan since Christian kindness has only turned out to be shallow courtesy. I moved my bench closer to him, made some friendly gestures, and did my best to engage him in conversation. At first, he hardly noticed my attempts, but then, after I mentioned his hospitality from the night before, he asked if we would be sharing a bed again. I said yes, and he seemed pleased, maybe even a little flattered. We then flipped through the book together, and I tried to explain the purpose of the printing and the meaning of the few pictures inside. I soon captured his interest, and from there, we started chatting as best we could about the various sights to see in this famous town. I suggested we share a smoke, and after he got out his pouch and tomahawk, he offered me a puff. We then took turns passing his wild pipe back and forth. If there had been any lingering ice of indifference in Queequeg's heart, this enjoyable smoke melted it away, and we became fast friends. He seemed to take to me just as naturally as I did to him. When we finished smoking, he pressed his forehead against mine, wrapped his arms around my waist, and said that from then on we were married, meaning, in his culture, that we were close friends and he would gladly die for me if necessary. In a fellow countryman, such a sudden bond of friendship would have felt too rushed and suspicious, but with this simple savage, those old rules didn't apply. After dinner and more friendly conversation and smoking, we went to our room together. He gave me his embalmed head as a gift, then pulled out his huge tobacco pouch. Digging underneath the tobacco, he pulled out about $30 in silver. He spread the coins on the table, divided them into 2 equal piles, pushed one toward me, and said it was mine. I was about to protest, but he silenced me by stuffing the coins into my pockets. I let them stay. He then went about his evening prayers, took out his idol, and removed the paper fireboard. By his gestures, it seemed he wanted me to join him, but knowing what was coming, I hesitated a moment, considering whether I would participate or not. I was a good Christian, raised in the infallible Presbyterian Church. How could I possibly join this wild idolater in worshiping his piece of wood? But what is worship? I thought. Do you really think, Ishmael, that the great God of heaven and earth, pagans included, could possibly be jealous of a small piece of black wood? That seems impossible. But what is worship? To do the will of God. That is worship. And what is the will of God? To treat my fellow man as I would want to be treated. That is the will of God. Now, Queequeg is my fellow man. What do I want Queequeg to do for me? I want him to join me in my Presbyterian form of worship. Therefore, I must join him in his. Thus, I must become an idolater. So I lit the shavings, helped prop up the little innocent idol, offered burnt biscuits to Queequeg, bowed before it 2 or 3 times, kissed its nose, and once that was done, we undressed and went to bed, at peace with ourselves and the whole world. But we didn't fall asleep without a little conversation. I don't know why it is, but there's no place like a bed for sharing secrets between friends. They say that husband and wife lay bare their souls to each other there, and some old couples chat about the past until nearly morning. So in our heart's honeymoon, there I lay with Queequeg, a cozy, loving pair.